So welcome to the 5th and special legal themed colloquium in our summer colloquium series on stereotyping and medical AI. It's been jointly organized by the Yeoh Lay Center for Politics, Philosophy and Law at King's College London, and in particular, Dr. Jonathan Gingerich, who will also be one of our esteemed panelists. The London Medical and AI Center for Value-Based Healthcare and the Sowerby Philosophy and Medicine Project. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Reuben as our chair for this panel discussion, who is the Senior Research Data Governance Manager at the London Medical Imaging and AI Center. So my name is Elselen Kingma. I'm the Sowerby Professor of Philosophy and Medicine at King's College London. We're very generous for the Sowerby Foundation to fund this project, the mission of which is to expand the conversation between medicine and philosophy and to engage medical researchers and practitioners and philosophers on questions, ethical, political, epistemic, metaphysical, etc., that concern us all as having real relevance in both medicine and philosophy. So I think I've already thanked in my notes say to thank to Jonathan Gingerich, the Yeoh Lay Center, and Reuben Carpenter and the London AI Center for co-organizing this colloquium. As per usual, we've posted the relevant links in the chat to follow our 3 respective projects and centers on social media. We've also posted a link to register for our next and 6th colloquium in this series, which is co-organized with the KCL chapter of Minorities and Philosophy, or MAP. This colloquium will take place in 2 weeks' time on the 12th of August, and Professor Zoe Johnson-King and Professor Boris Babik will be giving a talk entitled Algorithmic Fairness and Resent. And I just want to say, you may be wondering who is behind this all truly and who set up all these wonderful collaboration. And that of course is Winnie Ma, who is working with me on the Sowerby project at the moment. It's really hard doing, I think, to pull together this fantastic series and fantastic group of people. So having said that, I want to hand over to our chair, Reuben Carpenter from the AI Center, who will introduce our panelists, kick us off and manage this whole affair. Good luck to you, Reuben, and thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for the honor of chairing this fantastic event. Working in AI governance, I found that the current state of AI law to be a bit of a wild west, with competing international groups trying to set the bar for quality AI. Questions around stereotyping have very real implications in medical AI, and I'm excited about exploring this over the next 90 minutes. Each speaker is going to have 15 minutes to present, and then after that 60-minute slot, we'll have a 5-minute screen break, and then a 10-minute self-directed panel discussion, and then 10 minutes audience Q&A. I'll ask the audience to save their questions until the end. Speakers, as this is a packed session, if you're still talking at 15 minutes, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up at that point. Before we begin, I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker, and I'll do this in the order that they present. So firstly is Dr. Reuben Binns, who is an Associate Professor of Human-Centered Computing at Oxford University. His work sits at the intersection of computer science, law, and philosophy, focusing on data protection, machine learning, and the regulation of and by technology. Second is Dr. Jonathan Gingerich, who is a lecturer of philosophy of law at the YSL Center for Politics, Philosophy and Law, and has co-organized this panel discussion. He works on political philosophy, ethics, philosophy of law, and aesthetics. Next is Professor Georgi Gardiner, who is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Tennessee. She specializes in epistemology and metaphilosophy, and in particular, the nature of understanding and explanation. And our final speaker probably doesn't need an introduction, Professor David Papineau, who is a Professor of Philosophy of Science at the King's College London and a core member of the Philosophy and Medicine Project. He seems to specialize in everything, so it's of no surprise that he's turned his eye to the philosophy of AI. I really can't wait to hear what speakers have to say, and I don't want to delay it any further, so I'm going to pass over to you, Reuben, for the first talk.
Thank you. Really a delight to be here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, really lovely to be here. I should probably just give a bit of background about myself. So as Reuben said, I'm in the computer science department, but my first degree was in philosophy. So I've maintained a philosophical interest, and so I was very pleased to be contacted about this. One blind spot where I will be at a bit of a loss compared to some of the people here is around the medical field. It's something that I'm fascinated by, but feel very much out of my depth in. So apologize if my if I'm not able to kind of understand some of the issues that you'll be talking about, but hopefully I can provide a interesting perspective from a kind of ex-philosopher, now human-centered computer scientist. So I was really interested in the whole kind of theme for these talks around stereotyping and AI. And I think what I want to discuss is a couple of issues I have with talking about the sort of ethical risks of AI in terms of stereotyping. And I think I want to argue against the view that AI might be problematic because it involves stereotyping on the basis of group membership. And I think this claim is getting at something important. So I support the motivations I think people have in mind when they make the claim, but I think it's potentially misleading, and I think we should be careful of it for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I'd say that common arguments about why stereotyping is wrong are difficult to apply to AI. So when I say AI here, I'm thinking about primarily supervised machine learning systems. So these are systems that are based on learning algorithms which spot patterns in data, typically data that's been labeled by humans or by some other form of ground truth generating process. And so what you get from a machine learning algorithm is a statistical model that you can use to either predict a continuous variable, so a quantity of something, or classify something that's a new instance, something that the system has never seen before, but it can use the patterns it's seen in the past to make a prediction or a classification. So one of the common ideas about why stereotyping is bad is because it's false in some sense. So the generalizations that are involved in stereotypes are in some sense incorrect. So if we take the example of the stereotype that women are more empathetic than men, some people would argue this stereotype is wrong because not all women are more empathetic, or perhaps even that women are not on average more empathetic than men. So on this view, stereotypes are by their nature unsupported by available evidence, and that's what makes them wrong. And I think if this is your view as to why stereotyping is wrong, it's not going to work well as a critique of ML systems. And that's because ML systems, like all statistical models, typically don't produce stereotypes that are wrong because they're based on evidence, right? So they're based on training data. That's not to say that the training data is never problematic. It can be affected by various forms of bias. If it's labeled by human beings, then it might perpetuate some of the stereotypes that those human beings might be using when they're applying labels. But by and large, given the evidence that a machine learning model has to learn from, it will be supported by that evidence. So if there's something wrong with ML-based stereotyping, it can't simply be the same criticism that we might level against a cultural stereotype, that it's false, because these ML stereotypes, if we call them that, are typically going to be at least somewhat true. So it makes it difficult to apply this standard argument against stereotyping to ML. There might be other accounts of the wrongness of stereotyping, which might work better in the context of statistical models and ML. So if we can find an account of stereotyping which accepts that they can sometimes be supported by at least some evidence, but are nevertheless wrong in some way, then perhaps that's something that we can say in favor of the stereotype-based objection to ML systems. And I know in a previous seminar in the series, you had Erin Bealey talking about stereotyping. I think her paper on this topic is a really good exploration of the reasons why we might object to stereotypes, even if they are generically or universally true. So she argues, and I agree, that stereotypes are bad because they operate as controlling images or ideas in our minds that distort our thinking. She says true stereotypes can be dangerous. They cement social hierarchies and may be as difficult, if not more difficult, to challenge and change compared to untrue stereotypes. And they're problematic in large part due to their distorting effects on cognition, perception, imagination, memory, and attention. I think while agreeing with this as a criticism of, as an account of the wrongness of stereotypes, I think that this objection doesn't straightforwardly transfer over to machine learning systems. They're not subject to controlling images or ideas in the same way that human beings are. They don't have cognition which can be distorted by stereotypes in that way. Another objection to stereotyping is that it fails to treat people as individuals. And I think this is quite a compelling kind of argument, which could also apply to machine learning systems. And elsewhere, I've done research looking at people's perceptions of this problem, that they work based on generalizations, and even if those generalizations are well supported by evidence, there's still something objectionable about failing to treat someone as an individual. And there's always the chance that there will be individual mitigating factors which provide countervailing evidence, which in many cases the machine learning model wouldn't be able to factor in, because any model has to work with a limited set of features. And so there may always be considerations that are beyond the feature horizon that you might want to bring into play in an individual case. So I think that's a good objection to these systems. But I think in the context of medical AI, it's difficult to kind of carry that objection, because refusing to generalize at all would mean that we wouldn't be able to use statistical models in healthcare at all. And so I think that's going to have some, some issues in this context, although I do, support that argument in other contexts. Okay, so that's a little bit about why different accounts of stereotyping may or may not apply well to machine learning systems, even if they apply well to human forms of stereotyping. The second issue I have with characterizing potential ethical problems of medical AI systems in terms of stereotyping is the implication that machine learning systems deal with group-based inferences. I don't think that group-based differences is a differentiation or inferences is a good way of thinking about how statistical modeling works, especially when it comes to the forms of machine learning that are used today. So I don't think it's useful to, it's always helpful to describe machine learning as statistical generalizations about the groups that individuals belong to. I think talking about groups in this way can be subtly misleading in ways that will make it hard for us to think through these cases and have normative considerations kind of hit the right targets when it comes to machine learning systems. So normally when we talk about stereotyping, we think about inferences from a group. So you think about the group that someone's a member of, and then you think about what inferences you can draw from that. So protected characteristics like gender, race, other protected characteristics. We think about what inferences we can draw from the fact that somebody is a member of a group like that. But that's typically not how machine learning systems work. They typically don't have protected characteristics as features, and they typically have, rather than going from group membership to a bunch of different inferences, they take a huge range of different features and they combine those features and they place individuals within the feature space where these different features are interacting with each other in complex ways. And an individual might actually be completely alone in their point in feature space. So it's not about taking somebody's group membership and inferring a bunch of stuff about them. It's about placing individuals in a multi-dimensional feature space in relation to each other, but very much as individuals rather than as members of a group. So when we try to kind of apply this model of making statistical generalizations about groups that individuals belong to in the context of AI, I think it's slightly misleading. Now, you might think, well, that's fair, but in talking about the wrongness of statistical stereotyping, we use group membership as a kind of simplifying way of thinking about the objections. So if we can find something wrong with inferring something about someone on the basis of a group that they're a member of, then we can apply that same critique to a machine learning system that's more complicated than that. And I think that might be right. But the reason I'm still worried about thinking about it in that way is that I think that what we face with machine learning systems is a problem when it comes to the political formation of objections to these systems, right? So if you think about certain kinds of medical categories, so I'm thinking here about work from Ian Hacking, where he talks about how categories like autism and obesity became became what he calls socially constructed humankinds that are real but socially constructed. And one of the things about those categories is they correspond to real medical conditions, but they also are socially constructed in ways that allow people to become a group that is able to politically mobilize against certain forms of treatment and categorization, and advocate for for things as a group. And I think the problem with the machine learning systems, as I've said, is that we're not thinking about groups, we're thinking about people as individuals who are individualized in a feature space and put in relation to each other in ways that make it hard to get that kind of political, make it hard for me to imagine how you would politically mobilize around distinct groups that inferences are made about. So that's kind of my worry about, even if we can take this simplified version of statistical generalizations about groups and put it into the context of complex inferences based in large feature spaces, I think that it's still going to leave a limited scope for the kind of political mobilizations that you might want to see in relation to machine learning models. So we need to find other ways of forming solidarity, because there's no solidarity in feature space, would be the way I would characterize my concern there. So I don't know if I'm running over time already, but I'll finish up there, and we can hopefully discuss that more in the discussion.
Fantastic, Reuben. You actually had about 2 minutes left, but I'm sure we will definitely use up those other 2 minutes, so I appreciate that. I don't know if you know, but I've attended quite a few of your talks, and every single one I've really enjoyed, and I really enjoyed that one. So thank you so much for that. In the thinking of time, I'm going to move straight on to Jonathan next, if you're ready, Jonathan.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have a handout that I will just put in the chat here. I'm going to try to say something today briefly about the contours of a mid-19th century debate about statistics and freedom, and try to relate what, if anything, this debate might tell us about contemporary debates about AI and the prediction of human behavior. I'm going to suggest that while most philosophers rejected 19th century anxieties about the ability of statistical laws about human behavior to undermine our belief in human freedom, the concerns that were articulated in the 19th century suggest some ways in which the use of statistical evidence to form beliefs about individuals could be problematic, whether ethically or epistemically. Oh, volume is too loud.
Keeps moving back and forward. I don't know if other people are experiencing this, so it goes quieter and louder.
Yeah, I heard that.
Give me 1 second.
You know, what it sounds like is that the Zoom settings for the audio have gone to something other than the normal computer microphone or something like that. And so it's in a weird place with regard to the source of the sound.
Probably.
Or
right.
it sounds like you keep muffling the microphone and then removing your hand again, potentially. Something like that.
Also possible.
It's just that I do that all the time on my phone in my system.
So, sorry, does someone else want to go next while I try to set up a different microphone?
You sound fine now. You sound fine now. Just don't move.
Do you want to try again, Jonathan? If not, we'll move on to Georgie.
Maybe do that, because I'm going to try to plug in a headset and see if it works.
Are you happy to jump on, Georgie?
Yeah, sounds great.
Fantastic. Let's do this.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here and for organizing this, and also for attending in this kind of panel, this extremely interdisciplinary panel, challenging this kind of really rich intersection of all the areas. I mean, not literally all, but, you know, getting into history there. So we are getting close to all of the areas. I'm really thrilled to participate. So my contribution is going to be offering an epistemological framework for thinking through these questions. And epistemological here, that's a fancy pants word for like evidence, justification, belief, knowledge, rationality, like learning about the world, finding out about the world. And I'm going to present a framework of kind of what evidence does, like what is the epistemic goodness of evidence? that I think can help us think through some of these contours, or these normative, these kind of contours of the decision of the sort of what we're discussing. The ethics and practical stuff of using these AI in these medical contexts. Okay, so the idea is, the sort of framework I'm going to present is the relevant alternatives framework. The basic idea is that what evidence does is rule out error possibilities. So to give an example, suppose the claim is P, we'll just call the claim here P, the patient has breast cancer. Now suppose the evidence is a palpitation where you feel a lump. And so an error possibility might be a pulled muscle. And so you could do something like a blood test that comes back, and then sort of that would be sort of narrowing it down. Now suppose instead that the evidence is a blood test that's indicative of cancer. Now an error possibility might be that it's bone cancer instead of breast cancer. So which error possibilities are ruled out and not ruled out depends on the evidence that you have. And so in the background, there's this condition that if you know the P, then your evidence rules out the relevant error possibilities, the ordinary, everyday, normal ones, and you can ignore the far-fetched ones. So to give a non-medical example, take the claim Henry II was the firstborn child of his mother. That's that historical English king, that claim. And now suppose your evidence is he was king. If that evidence is not enough, why? Because he could have an older sister, for example, or could have an older brother who died before they managed to ascend to the throne, or it was an older brother who was ineligible to be the king, perhaps because same mother, different father, and so on. But of course, now as a historian can look into the record, rule out those error possibilities. Yeah, no record of an older sister. Now, and so you rule out all those error possibilities. Now you can know that Henry II was the firstborn child of his mother. There are other error possibilities that evidence doesn't address. What about ones like the Empress Matilda, the mother, actually the baby died in childbirth and she snuck in a new baby. And that the real mother actually had many children beforehand, right? The evidence that I just said doesn't rule that one out. But the thought is that is like disregardably far-fetched. We can just ignore it. That's just kind of a weird case. We can just ignore that one. We don't have to rule out all the error possibilities. There'll be other ones too, like the Empress Matilda managed to hide an earlier pregnancy and childbirth. Very unlikely, given the evidence, given the social circumstances. So that's the basic relevant alternatives structure. Your evidence has to rule out the ordinary, everyday, normal possibilities, but you can ignore the really weird, far-fetched ones. Okay, so to give a medical example, and I'm going to give a very stylistic medical example here. Suppose that the claim is that patient has disease D, and now the evidence is the results of a blood test, say low platelet count, something like that. And this low platelet count could be caused by disease D or disease E. And then suppose there's this other piece of evidence, disease E only occurs in females and the patient is male. And so now the thought is that evidence rules out E, and so the doctor can conclude that they have disease D, that's kind of enough evidence to sort of work on the assumption that they have disease D. Now, there are going to be other error possibilities not ruled out, like that there was a mix up in the lab with the blood test, and it's actually somebody else's blood, for example. But the thought is, in a normal, ordinary, well-working circumstance, the doctors just ignore that possibility. They don't worry about that possibility when they're sort of doing their day-to-day business. They can just assume that the lab results came back accurately. That's a kind of toy, stylized medical example of the relevant alternatives framework. Okay, so I want to make some observations about that framework that I think help illuminate these kinds of discussions. I'm going to sort of make 3 observations, but I'm not going to sort of defend them, right? I don't have time for that. But I think these are kind of 3 helpful observations, or perhaps can be. So the first one is that a single piece of evidence, just having one piece of evidence, is somewhat impotent at ruling out that piece of evidence is misleading. So if your evidence is something like a high base rate, like most patients with this symptom have the disease D, then it doesn't rule out the possibility that they are an exception to that sort of piece of evidence. So that actually the evidence is misleading in that case. So single pieces of evidence, one thing that they can't do often is rule out the possibility that in that case it's misleading evidence, or that the patient is an exception or something like that. So there's something particularly weak in that regard about single source evidence, single pieces of evidence. Even if that evidence makes it very likely that P. So if the base rate is such that it's a really high chance, like almost everyone with disease D almost everyone with this symptom has disease D, very high chance. But one thing that piece of evidence doesn't do is rule out the possibility that that evidence is misleading in the case, the person is an exception, and so on. So there's something strong, there can be something very strong about single source evidence, but this framework illuminates a particular weakness, and it doesn't rule out that it's misleading. So, but a second piece of evidence can, so second pieces of evidence can be really powerful. And so that second piece of evidence doesn't just raise the probability of P, but also does something else. It rules out particular error possibilities, namely that that first piece of evidence was misleading. And I'm going to illustrate with a case. I'm just going to first say the second point I want to make. And the second point I want to just gesture at, and I'm not going to sort of defend this particularly, is that there's something about secondary or this corroborating evidence that's particularly important in the practical realm or the moral or the social realm, as opposed to just sort of just forming beliefs and inferences, the more epistemic realm. Once we get into the practical, the moral, the social, now this corroborating evidence, this ruling out more distant error possibilities is kind of playing more of a role. It seems more important when we're relying on evidence for action. Okay, so kind of an illustration here. So suppose the blood test comes back and it's given the blood test, it's very, very likely to be disease D, very, very high chance given the base rates, but the treatment is invasive, there's very negative consequences. If the evidence is merely this base rate evidence, that most people with this blood profile have disease D, then we want something else before we start the treatment. We want some other second piece of evidence. And so we could have this second piece of evidence say like, well, the alternative is that it's disease E, but if you have disease E, you have symptom X, they don't have symptom X, so we can rule out disease E. Something like that, some extra second thing that means that it sort of distinguishes them from the people who have that blood profile, but they're the disease E people, the rare disease people. So we've got most people have disease who have the blood profile are disease D people, should do the treatment. Some small number are disease E people. We want to rule out that they're one of those people before we start the treatment. But the probability was already really high. The second piece of evidence does something different. It makes the error possibility, the one where they don't have disease D, kind of far away, more distant, more far-fetched. It was already a high probability, but now if they don't have disease E, it's not just a high probability, but also they have disease E, which is already rare, but then now they have disease E without symptom X, which is very unusual and abnormal, like the people with disease E have X. And so we've made it a far-fetched possibility. That's the kind of power of second source evidence, secondary kinds of evidence. So the first two observations there, to recap, and I went through them very quickly. One is so it's that single source evidence has a kind of impotence, a kind of paltriness that it can't rule out that it is misleading, even if it makes it very probable that P. That second source evidence can do that. So there's something very powerful and important about second source evidence. And I gestured at the idea that perhaps, particularly when we're relying on the evidence for action, we really care about that second source evidence. Doesn't just increase probability, makes the sort of remaining error possibilities more far-fetched, and maybe something about action makes that really important. Okay, third observation is that statistical evidence, base rate evidence, can be of this single source evidence and of the kind that tends to leave relevant error possibilities uneliminated. Well, okay, what do I mean? Let's compare it to other kinds of single source evidence, ones that don't have this worry. Okay, so I look out the window and I see it's not raining. That's single source evidence here, it's perception. I see it's not raining, just one piece of evidence. But it's pretty good evidence. Like I can just like assume it, right? Even if it's for action, right? Because the error possibilities are like I'm hallucinating, I'm in a simulation, like there is some very weird trick going on. So it's single source evidence, but it rules out relevant error possibilities because the only remaining ones are really weird and far-fetched. It's also the probability is also extremely, extremely high, right? So probability is playing a big role here as well. Similarly, testimony. So suppose that my partner says to, I'm in a windowless room, I'm in a hospital, characteristically, right, lots of windowless rooms there. Then my partner says it's raining, it's not raining outside. Again, it's single source evidence, it's one piece of testimony, but the error possibilities are like he's lying or that he's mistaken, very kind of far-fetched. It's just one piece of evidence, but I can typically trust testimony for many things for single source evidence. is kind of sufficient by itself. And I see it's not raining in London right now. I didn't want to use rain example. If it was raining in London, it'd be insensitive of me because I'm in Tennessee and I know it rains a bit more in London. But I did a lot of time in Scotland, so I feel like I've had my share of rain. Okay, so the idea is that if it's base rate evidence, it's more like it's the kind of evidence that leaves the uneliminated error possibilities are the nearby ones, the relevant ones, the less far-fetched ones. Why? Because the person could be an exception to that base rate. So it's something, I mean, this is simplifying a bit, but it's more like a dice roll. Like they could be in this, they could be just the exception, they could be not. It's kind of like, well, look, if you take a D20, a 20-sided dice, probably it's not going to land heads, very high chance, but it's just a dice roll. It could easily land 20. And so it's a relevant error possibility. And the idea is that the statistical evidence, base rate evidence can be of that nature. Not always, I think, and that's kind of part of what Reuben was getting at with his sort of second big chunk of comment there. And then similarly, there's some kind of black box algorithms where it could be that there's a kind of that is just one single source of evidence. And then there's this worry, the error possibility that the underlying statistical model is wrong. And if all the evidence you have is that black box algorithm, it could be that that's a relevant error possibility and it's not one that your single piece of evidence is sort of has the power to address, to rule out. So the thought is that base rate evidence puts you in a reference class, it puts you in a bucket, and it doesn't distinguish you from the other ones, the negatives in that reference class, in that bucket. So you have that blood profile, probably disease D, could be disease E, nothing about that statistic. If the evidence is just statistical, it doesn't tell you that you're sort of, it doesn't, there's nothing, the evidence is impotent to do anything to distinguish you from you as the outlier or the exception from most people in the bucket. But and this is where we sort of get into Reuben's thing, not all evidence, not all AI uses of AI are single source evidence. And so one thing to do here could be to sort of distinguish, to sort of understand the relative epistemic and moral problems, perceived problems of base rate evidence, statistical evidence, AI, say it's not really about that, AI and not AI, it's about single source evidence and multiple source evidence, and whether that evidence can rule out relevant error possibilities or not. And so then one of the characteristic issues is that when base rate evidence or statistical evidence or AI is commonly perceived to be of this single source evidence kind. So the upshots here, secondary evidence can be really powerful, not just as a matter of raising probability, because single source evidence can make something really, really probable, but also ruling out relevant error possibilities. And so even if there's just more evidence, but it's more evidence of a base rate kind, it's more evidence, and so it's sort of no longer single source evidence, and so it's corroborating evidence, and that there might be something kind of that part of the debates about base rate evidence, statistical evidence, and AI are actually getting at the worries about single source evidence as opposed to multiple sources of evidence, corroborating evidence, and that's best understood through a framework that isn't merely probabilistic, because single source evidence can make something probably likely, like really probable, but multiple source evidence does something else epistemically. So I see I'm at I'm at 15 minutes, so I will stop there. Thanks.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Georgie, and a fantastic talk as well. I've been frantically scribbling notes as you spoke away. Are we good to go on the next talk, Jonathan?
I hope so. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, definitely.
That sounds
Great.
like, yeah, that's good.
Great. As I said, I have a handout that I put into the chat. Hopefully everybody can see that. That's just some quotations that I'm going to mention. So today I want to briefly mention some contours of a 19th century debate about statistics and freedom, and invite some reflection on what, if anything, it might tell us about contemporary debates about AI and the prediction of human behavior. This is a very preliminary project, and my aim today is mostly to stimulate some interest in the enduring significance of an often overlooked 19th century discourse, rather than trying to establish a specific claim about the ethics of stereotyping or statistical generalizations about individuals. But I hope that we'll see some interesting things from what some 19th century people had to say. So to begin, the early 19th century was a heady time for statisticians. For the first time, European governments began tabulating and publishing tabulations about a wide variety of social facts, pertaining particularly to crime and health. And there was, as Ian Hacking reports, an avalanche of printed numbers in the 1820s and 30s as governments began to publish these tabulations. As these tabulations became available, statisticians were more and more able to discover statistical regularities about the behavior of populations. An international apparatus emerged at the same time with an aim of standardizing the sorts of figures collected about populations in different places, and that sought to develop a theoretical discourse in support of these projects of tabulation and statistical inference. Against this backdrop, in the mid-19th century, there was a brief flurry of philosophical anxiety about statistical fatalism that lasted for just a few decades before dying out. This was what Ian Hacking has called a silly season for determinism. Statistical fatalism was a concern that was associated with the thought, particularly of Aimé Quetelet, Adolphe d'Angeville, and particularly English historian T.H. Buckle, that thought that the discovery of statistical laws that govern the behavior of human populations showed that free will was impossible in some respect. The anxiety provoked by this idea was most pronounced with respect to behaviors that were seen as personal moral affairs, but that conformed to fairly strict statistical regularities. So suicide seems deeply personal, but close to exactly the same number of people commit suicide in London every year. So how are we to make sense of this? So I'd like to mention a few thinkers that sort of lead up to this moment of statistical fatalism in the late 1850s. Quetelet, who's one of the founders of modern statistics, writing in the 1830s and 40s, hoped to find statistical regularities in the free choices of individuals. So he asked in an 1835 treatise, are human actions regulated by fixed laws? And he answered that they are if we look at large enough populations. This is the first long quotation on the handout that I think is worth reading through. He imagines this analogy. He says, we may instance the case of a person examining too nearly a small portion of a very large circle, and who consequently would see in this detached portion merely a certain quantity of physical points grouped in a more or less irregular manner, and so indeed as to seem as if they had been arranged by chance, notwithstanding the care with which the original figure may have been traced. But placing himself a greater distance, the eye embraces of necessity a greater number of points, and already a degree of regularity is observable over a certain extent of the segment of the circle. By removing still farther from the object, the observer loses sight of the individual points, no longer observes any accidental or odd arrangements amongst them, but discovers at once the law presiding over the general arrangements, and the precise nature of the circle so traced. Let us suppose, as might happen, that the different points of the arch, instead of being material points, were small animated beings free to act according to their will in a very circumscribed sphere, yet these spontaneous motions would not be perceived by the eye placed at a suitable difference. So Quetelet's thought is, if you have individuals acting according to their own volition, if you look at them individually, you get lots of variation, things look random. But if you zoom out, if you look at a big enough population, you start seeing the arch of the circle. You start seeing the regularities that govern large populations. And Quetelet continues, the greater the number of individuals observed, the more do individual peculiarities, whether physical or moral, become effaced and leave in a prominent point of view the general facts by virtues of which society exists and is preserved. It belongs only to a few men gifted with superior genius to alter sensibly the social state, and even this alternation or action requires a considerable time to transmit fully its effects. So as we discover statistical regularities about human behavior, we see that we are more generic than we would have thought if we looked at individual behaviors without seeing them as part of larger patterns. And we see that it's only a small number of geniuses that have the capacity to alter this sort of general pattern of behavior. Now, this provides some of the foundations for a line of thought that turns into statistical fatalism and that reaches its height in the work of English historian Buckle, who looked at the printed numbers and statistical irregularities and arrived at the conclusion that we don't have free will. So he notes that even in London, notwithstanding the vicissitudes incidental to the largest and most luxurious capital in the world, we see a regularity in the most sanguine, we see this great regularity in apparently personal behaviors. He says, in this vast metropolis, about 240 persons every year make away with themselves, the annual suicides oscillating from the pressures of temporary causes between 266, the highest, and 213, the lowest. And just from looking at these regularities, from seeing that the number of suicides is relatively constant from year to year in London, Buckle concludes that the offenses of man, such as suicide, are the result not so much of the vices of the individual offender as of the state of society into which that individual is thrown. And he sort of goes on in a rush, saying, it is evident that if it can be demonstrated that the bad actions of men vary in obedience to the changes in the surrounding society, we shall be obliged to infer that their good actions, which are, as it were, the residue of their bad ones, vary in the same manner. And we shall be forced to the further conclusion that such variations are the result of large and general causes, which, working upon the aggregate of society, must produce certain consequences without regard to the volition of those particular men of whom the society is composed. So Buckle takes these statistical regularities that he's looking at, and rather than treating them as regularities in how volition is exercised, as they are for Quetelet in his analogy to the circle, Buckle thinks that these regularities are evidence of the absence of volition. Instead, all that there is are these social background conditions that result in the patterns of behavior like suicides in London. And this sort of maybe well, almost certainly leads Buckle to a too quick move to a conclusion that free will is absent. Now, while Buckle might appear a little bit sloppy to a contemporary audience, he was massively influential in the 1850s and 60s, and his line of thought gave rise to a feeling on the part of proponents of the development of statistics that concerns of fatalism needed to be refuted. So figures including William Farr, John Venn, and even Prince Albert, who devoted part of his inaugural address at the 1861 Statistical Congress, held at Somerset House in London, to arguing that statistical fatalism was not a threat to individual free will. So Farr, an English statistician, argued in 1861 that statistical regularities about human behavior need not concern us overly much because they relate to, because statistics has revealed also a law of variation in addition to its laws of regularities. So Farr says, under one system of working, mining operations kill 8 in 1,000 men annually, under another system 4. And in both systems, the proportion over a series of years ranges within limits determinable mathematically. Introduced a system of ventilation in unventilated mines, and you substitute one law of accidents for another. He continues, as men have the power to change the conditions of life and even to modify their race, they have the power to change the current of human actions within definite limits, which statistics can determine. And so here we have this sort of Queteletian thought about the ability of geniuses to alter these regularities put into the discourse of social planning as it's developing in the mid-19th century. And for Farr, the articulation of statistical regularities then does not give us evidence of the absence of free will because planners and governments might choose to intervene to alter the conditions that give rise to regularities of behavior at the levels of populations. Similarly, in 1861, Prince Albert responded to the grave accusations that statistical science leads to fatalism and therefore deprives man of his dignity, arguing that because statistics only makes apparent general laws, these are inapplicable to any special case. And so while it's possible to have regularities at the level of the population. Once you focus on the individuals, those points that make up Quetelet's circle, you still have free will. And then slightly later, more sophisticated arguments against statistical fatalism were developed by the logician John Venn, who wrote in 1866, foreshadowing, I think, some 20th century work on freedom and agency, like that of Peter Strawson and Thomas Nagel. Venn thought that the temptation towards statistical fatalism arose from a muddling of 2 points of view, a speculative point of view and a practical point of view. He says there's firstly a speculative point of view, which we are in consistency bound to retain, where we are not concerned with the results of hypothetical alterations, but are drawing inference as to whether such alterations will be made. And then in distinction to this point of view, Venn says there is a practical standing point, and every agent, whether or not his conduct forms any part of any table of statistics, finds himself in this point of view the center of a sphere of action. When this position is occupied, we consider whether the efforts will be, not whether the efforts will be made, but we are distinctly taking into discussion the different results according to which they are made or not. So from the speculative point of view, the view in which statistical regularities appear, we have no right when talking about the future to use any other expressions than those which denote simple futurity. While rejecting statistical fatalism as a ludicrous doctrine in certain respects, Venn acknowledges that taking exclusively the speculative point of view can lead to cynicism, and we can avoid the danger of always discussing the joys and sorrows of our fellow men in a way which, though legitimate when we are avowedly taking a partial view of the subject, too easily lapses into a hopeless indifference or cynicism. So that's a very quick tour through this 19th century debate about statistical fatalism. By the end of the 19th century, anxiety about statistical fatalism had more or less disappeared from the intellectual atmosphere, partly because of the growing accumulation of data and associated statistical regularities made the question moot, and partly because philosophers and statisticians judged replies like those of Farr and Venn to be convincing. Most recent philosophers have felt the same way, devoting very little attention to the short-lived phenomena of statistical fatalism. But I would like to suggest that in certain respects, contemporary concerns about data and prediction that are analogous to those that drove anxiety about statistical fatalism have arisen. Statistics predated the 19th century, but in the 19th century, the scale at which statistics were collected about defined populations and subsets of populations and used for purposes of governance exploded. In the early 20th century, algorithmic techniques and machines that have been around for decades have been paired with a massively increasing amount of data, generally increasing the capacity for accurate individualized predictions about behavior. The growth of algorithmic power has given rise to concerns about how algorithmic prediction might compromise our free will, including in prominent works such as that of Shoshana Zuboff and Brett Frischman and even Selinger's recent book. And there are quotations from both of them on the handout, although I won't go into them because I'm running low on time. Just to sort of suggest what some of these connections between statistical fatalism and contemporary debate might be. Ian Hacking, who's one of the only philosophers who's recently written about statistical fatalism, concludes that the real concern about the growth of 19th century statistics was a political one about the power of the state that was confused with a metaphysical concern about free will. And this seems largely right to me. What is troubling about statistical regularities is less our in-principle predictability than the social and political uses to which statistical generalizations about individuals are put. And seeing individuals as having the potential only for small variations in behavior that Quetelet imagines of the dots that make up a circle can lead us to think of the statistical categories that we use as more reified than they really are. For it can lead us to think that the categories exist outside of the choices of people and that categories are not subject to radical change over time, except perhaps through the liberal social planning promoted by statisticians like Farr. So I know this is much more suggestive than argumentative, but I hope that I've piqued some people's interest in how these 19th century debates about statistical beliefs might matter for contemporary debates about the ethics and epistemology of artificial intelligence. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm really glad that we've got the 5-minute screen break, so I can just think through everything that you just said. There's a lot to think about there. But if we can move on to our final talk from David, if you are happy to go ahead.
I better unmute first. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I have a screen to share, so let me pull that up. Can everybody see that now? Yeah? You can see, what can you see exactly? Can you see the slideshow? Not yet. Now I better do the slideshow. Play from the start. Okay.
Fantastic.
Can I move that? Okay, that's good. That's good. So, okay, so Reuben said at the beginning, I'm a specialist on everything, lots of things. In fact, there's 3 things I'm not a specialist on, which is AI, the law, and medicine. So I had to think a bit about what to talk about, but I've had a bit of a go. And I'm going to talk about protected characteristics and AI prediction. And I'll start with, oh dear, I can't see my clock anymore. Now I'm sharing the whole damn screen. It's okay, I've got a phone here. So let me think, I should finish by 5 past, good. So I'll start with my conclusion. Now I can't move the screen along, yeah. So I don't think AI systems, AI algorithms are capable of dealing with anti-discrimination legislation like the 2010 UK Equality Act. And let me argue through to that conclusion. So I want to start with the assumption that we have some AI algorithm that will predict some result. Job success, car accidents, mortgage defaults, criminal recidivism, and so on. And I want to assume that it's well trained on data about real outcomes, real job success, real recidivism, not people's estimates of that might be biased, and that it's trained on a data set that's representative of the whole population, so it's not some untypical subgroup. So it's really good, and I agree with Reuben. I mean, a system like this, there's no reason to suppose it will embody any false stereotypes. It will be accurately predicting when these things are going to happen. That's what I want to assume. But in some contexts, we don't want to work with systems like that. There are, in many jurisdictions, legal requirements that certain characteristics are protected, and we aren't supposed to use them in making decisions in the public sphere. So you're not supposed to use information about gender or ethnicity in giving people jobs. We might think in a minute about or later on about why exactly that. So how that's supposed to work, but I mean that's the legal situation, and I think many of us would agree that this is a good thing. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in the context of medicine. It raises more issues. It's not clear that we do really have an issue that needs us to respect protected characteristics in medicine. We might talk about, I'll talk about a case where it's rather clear. I'm going to look at gender and insurance. And it's rather striking that in the EU, and I believe also in California, gender is a protected characteristic with respect to insurance premiums. You aren't allowed to take gender into account in fixing insurance premiums. It was a ruling in 2012. In fact, the opinion was written in 2010. Julian Kokott said, come on, it's not gender as such that's responsible for insurance risks. There's all kinds of other differences between people of a given gender that they share. So there's gender statistically associated with risks, but there are other factors like economic and social conditions, professional activity, family environment, drugs, stimulants, and so on. And that's what we should be basing our insurance premiums on, not on on gender. I mean, it used to be that I mean, this took the wind out of Sheila's wheels. Very, very good insurance company that offered women cheaper insurance premiums because women had less car accidents, and they weren't allowed to do that anymore. The exception was ruled out. Okay, now you might think, I'm thinking of Reuben again, that why is that bad for AI? I mean, just get an AI algorithm to respect the ruling. I mean, don't give it gender information. You'd think, well, a standard deep learning algorithm would probably be a whiz at identifying all those other characteristics that are predictive of car accidents or job success or whatever. I mean, just leave out the protected characteristics and you'll have a good predictor of what you want to know about. But it's not that simple, because UK legislation, and I suspect other equality acts, also preclude indirect discrimination. So in effect, they want to stop you using proxies for gender or ethnicity in making decisions in the public sphere. They don't want policies that will have a disproportionate negative influence on any given protected characteristic group. So this legal requirement means that the algorithms mustn't use proxies for protected characteristics other. If you set insurance premiums using some characteristic that's strongly associated with gender, then you will still be discriminating in practice, if not directly. It'd be indirect discrimination, not direct discrimination. So I want to think about mortgage default insurance. I think I was talking to, I don't know if Arjun's here, but I was talking to him, and he talked about the way in which AI systems might discriminate against women in respect of mortgage default insurance you have to pay the mortgage lenders against the possibility you might end up defaulting on your mortgage repayments. And it used to be that women were predicted to default more often. They would, before the protected characteristic legislation, have been given higher premiums. Okay, so now the insurance company isn't allowed to use gender in setting the higher premium. But suppose it's the case that part of the reason that women were more likely to default, this is not entirely realistic, but I wanted to keep it simple, is that they smoke more, so they're more likely to fall ill and lose income. So now you might think, well, the AI algorithm that's trying to predict who's going to default will just look at the probability of defaulting given that you smoke. But this will be indirect discrimination if the smoking is much more common among women than among men. Because you'll be penalizing women not just for smoking, which you might think was perfectly reasonable, but also just for being women, because smoking is predictive of being a woman. So they're getting, as it were, a double hit if you set premiums in line with the risk for smokers, and that wouldn't be fair. Now, this is in fact a real conundrum for the actuaries. If they aren't allowed to use any characteristics that are correlated with gender, they're going to have trouble predicting risks at all, because pretty much everything is going to be correlated with gender to some degree or other. So in fact, they've come up with an ingenious solution. I'm getting this from a paper, Insurance Pricing, the Proxy Problem, in The Actuary, June 2020. And what they say is, don't use the probability of default given that you smoke, but use an adjusted figure, a weighted average of the probability of defaulting giving you a smoke and you're a woman, or plus the probability weighted by the probability of being a woman. Can you see my cursor? I don't think you can. You can see my cursor, that's good. I've got two probabilities, that's a misprint. Plus the probability of defaulting if you smoke and a man weighted by the probability of being a man. The point is that this figure is meant to indicate how much extra difference smoking makes the defaulting, independently of the other influences that gender might have on defaulting. Perhaps it'll be easier if you look at this picture. I mean, here's a causal diagram. So the idea is that being a woman increases causes defaults in some cases, but also causes smoking, which causes defaults. And what you don't want to do is set high premiums because of this influence. You only want to set high premiums because of the smoking. So what you want to know is how much difference would smoking make to defaulting if it wasn't correlated with being a woman? And that's what that sum is designed to do. It's disentangling the influence of smoking on defaulting from the influence of being a woman on defaulting, and just giving you extra premiums for being a smoker and not for being a woman. So that's fine. That's in line with the legislation. And you might think that a sophisticated AI system would be able to cope with this. It would need to do some causal inference. I mean, it's interesting. The AI system would need to be given data on gender as well as on smoking and all other characteristics, precisely so that it can disentangle the influence of smoking and gender on defaults and only charge you extra for the smoking. So that looks fine so far, and so it is. But there's something funny about this, because look at this diagram. We've looked at this route from being a woman to defaulting, and we've said, well, don't penalize them for being a woman themselves, just do it for the smoking. But presumably, this route, the other routes, we haven't said anything about it yet, from being a woman to defaulting, also goes via intermediaries, and shouldn't we do the same thing there and look at the other characteristics that are intermediate between women and defaulting, and have a look at their influence and charge for that? But now it isn't obvious that that would be right. There'll be cases and cases. It depends on how being a woman influences defaulting. So suppose it influences defaulting not just via smoking, but because it increases the chance of pregnancy and so of income loss. I take it that wouldn't be okay for insurers to use. Insurers to estimate the chance of pregnancy. In fact, just to make doubly sure they don't do that, pregnancy and maternity is itself a protected characteristic. So that's one case. Here's a different case. Suppose women tend to gravitate towards more interesting and socially involved jobs, which are therefore less secure. I take it would be all right for actuaries to use that. I mean, they could drop the premiums for women who are in secure jobs and raise them for men in insecure jobs, and now we'd just be looking at the security of the job as something you had to pay for, and it wouldn't really be gender at all. That would be okay. But now think of a yet further case. Imagine that being a gender influences the chance of default because women are treated more harshly by credit agencies through sheer sexist prejudice. If that was the case, I think it would be wrong for the actuaries to use credit agency ratings. I mean, it would be the kind of influence on gender on insurance premiums we're trying to protect against. So thinking of those cases, the conclusion I draw is that even after we've disentangled different causal influences, decisions about which traits can be properly used to set insurance premiums need us to take a view about whether those traits are part of the characteristic we're aiming to protect, like pregnancy, and about whether the route via the traits in question, secure jobs, credit rating is the kind of influence that we're trying to protect against if it was due to sexism. And the point I want to make is that existing AI systems, all those that I know about, clearly aren't designed to make these kinds of judgments. So we can't rely on AI systems to predict, to advise us how to make judgments about outcomes in the context where we're supposed to not use protected characteristics in making those judgments. In the face of that kind of demand, AI systems are no help. And that's all I have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. What a brilliant insight. I'm going to jump straight to the screen break so we can get back to and start the panel discussion soon. So it's 18:07. So if everybody could come back at 18:12, and then we'll start the panel. Looking forward to it. Welcome back, everyone. Let's check all the speakers are with us. Georgie, I can see you. I can see you, Reuben. I can see Jonathan, and I can see you, David. Fantastic. So now for the meat of the event, the panel discussion. I wanted to see if any of the speakers had any thoughts or questions or challenges they wanted to throw at each other, basically trying to turn you against each other to some extent, before I start throwing questions at. If you put your hand up, or yeah, please, Georgie.
I mean, this isn't a very good attempt to sort of turn against each other, but I just sort of, it occurred to me that David could sort of write up his ideas in a popular venue where the title is In Defense of Liberal Education or In Defense of the Liberal Arts, because I think part of the framing, right, at his kind of conclusion there could be the ineliminability of understanding and explanation, because the sort of thought is, what's going on here is you have to understand society, understand people, and mere data will never be enough. Mere social data will never be enough. I mean, that's like a much stronger claim than David made, right? Because you were just talking about what they currently do and so on, but the difficulty of that it would be to sort of work out what counts as sexism and how to eliminate that, as opposed to some other justified response, right? Like your women get sort of more screened more often for breast cancer. Is that sexism or is that some other thing? And trying to filter that through. But the thought is that you need to understand history and society and psychology, and yes, you need like history and culture in order to do that, and that sort of mere computers can never do that. And so that's why we need the liberal arts education. I mean, like I say, that's a much bigger conclusion than David was pressing, but I want to see the public philosophy piece. We need the liberal arts. Algorithms can't do it.
Yeah, but there's another bit there which even with the liberal arts education, I'm not sure I got a solution to, because part of the difficulty of thinking about these things is it's not entirely clear what is the underlying rationale for the anti-discrimination legislation. And I mean, there's two thoughts. One is that it's demeaning, it's disrespectful, it's not right to judge people on such characteristics as gender and ethnicity. You owe it to them to get more information. That's one line of thought. Another line of thought is that it's not fair. I mean, if, say, certain characteristics make your life more difficult, it's not fair, and we should have kind of compensation equality of outcomes. And those are two different lines of thought, and they impact differently on which pathways you think, which kinds of ways of charging insurance are right. But I noticed that Reuben has put in the chat, I'm sorry about this, Georgie, that he's already got a machine that's being designed to make these judgments. Could you tell us more about that, Reuben?
Sure. It's not my machine, but yeah, I've put in a link to a paper by Hoda Hadari and co-authors. It's one of many papers that's in this space of fair machine learning, which is a kind of research field which has been going, I guess, for about 10 years now. And what they do is, which is quite interesting, is they take luck egalitarianism. So luck egalitarianism is a theory in political philosophy that basically says people should be compensated for the results of bad luck, but not for the choices that they make willingly. And so they try to bring in luck egalitarianism to provide a framework where a machine learning engineer could actually say, well, these features are ones for which we would not hold people responsible because they're the results of bad luck, and these features are, and then we can do we can basically build that into a constraint on the model that we build, which I think is, I'm not totally on board with luck egalitarianism, but if you were, then I can see like this framework being an interesting attempt to instantiate that in a machine learning model. The other reason I'm not convinced by that is because I think the theories of distributive justice are meant to apply at the level of the whole society, whereas machine learning models are deployed in particular contexts. So, you end up with an insurance provider or, you know, a recruiter trying to embed macro level principles of justice rather than a sort of utopian social planner or the people behind the veil of ignorance trying to design the basic structure of society according to those principles. So I think that there's a slight issue there, but yeah, it's certainly a very interesting space. So yeah, encourage people to check that out.
Thank you.
I've got a question for everybody, which is, should we be worrying about protected characteristics in the medical context? I mean, let me give an example. So one of the previous speakers was worried about an algorithm that was deciding whether women should have cesareans or vaginal births on the basis of race. And she described how people stopped, I mean, the system stopped doing that and had gone for hypertension instead, which is what race was actually a proxy for. And I mean, I'm not sure, it's not so obvious to me. Look, there are questions of economy here. I mean, if in the medical context, it's, I mean, suppose, which isn't true, that the diagnostic test will be very expensive, the ethnicity is a good proxy, that nobody, I mean, is it demeaning to have this decision made on the grounds of race in the medical context? It's not obvious to me that it is, but I don't know. Winnie is the one who I think has been thinking about this the most.
Does Winnie or does anyone else want to stab at that? Jonathan?
Well, I mean, David, I think maybe this goes to the last point that you made in response to Georgi. My feeling, I have a tough time getting the pull of seeing just the moral significance of stopping discrimination on the basis of protected categories. It seems to me that the compelling motivation for anti-discrimination law is something like combating hierarchy or subordination. And if that's the fundamental justification of anti-discrimination law, then protected categories are just sort of like an easily administrable way of achieving that aim. And you know, whether or not, so then you need an analysis of whether allowing decision making to include considerations about a particular identity category is going to undermine or entrench hierarchy. And if that's the line that you take, then it seems like it's not, I mean, so you might still have sort of like administrability concerns. Maybe you think we need to prevent consideration of race in all sorts of medical AI decision making, because if we allow it in, then it's going to spill over and have these, it's going to further entrench racial hierarchies in medicine. But it still seems like it ultimately has to have some sort of further foundation beyond just a concern with protected categories, or else it seems like it's like there's this sort of risk of incoherence in anti-discrimination law, where it ends up just saying like people should be treated on the basis of considerations that are relevant to decision making, but without any sort of bite that's going to actually change how like healthcare institutions or AI systems make their decisions.
Good. Does anyone want to respond before we go into the Q&A?
This isn't a response exactly. It's another little comment that sort of might also help inform David's question, which is this is general issues with statistical evidence in medicine, and are there really any issues there at all? And I wonder if part of an important contour here is that we often think of medicine as only ever being helpful. It's like treatment, so how could it ever be wrong? And I think this is a really, really interesting question. And one thing that might help illuminate it as well is thinking of other areas of medicine, perhaps ones that are stigmatized, perhaps mental health and behavioral health medicine, and also ones that might limit freedom. So I have in mind things like birth control for the severely cognitively disabled, potentially controversial ones like cochlear implants. Now, I'm not answering David's question at all. I'm just saying these things could also be like interesting contours, just so we don't get too much funneled into thinking of medicine as only ever helpful policies and helpful interactions, but also having this more like historical or critical race account of medicine where it does like also has negative impacts on groups and so on.
Fantastic. Thank you. I want to respond to that, but what I should do as chair is ask the audience to say if you have any questions, please put a Q in the chat, and I will address you in chronological order for our last 7 minutes, though the speakers are giving me permission to run over just a little bit if we need to, but I'll try not to do that. But we'll start with Oslin's question, because you said, would you like to ask whether you could ask a question?
Yeah, although I fear now it's not a question, but no, maybe it is. I mean, so I think it's a fascinating discussion, but I also wonder to what extent it just comes back to the same discussion that's been had before, right? So discussion's been had before about, for example, whether to use racial categories at all, but whether they're real or not. They're obviously not real, but they are socially real. And then kind of point you end up as, well, you should definitely use them for certain or not others, right? I mean, you should use them in order to be able to measure and document racial discrimination, for example, right? You need to use racial categories, but you shouldn't use them for other kinds of purposes, right? Same with maternity. I mean, you should not use maternity when you hire somebody, but you should use them when you need to check whether somebody's allowed to go on maternity leave, et cetera, et cetera. So isn't like David's problem, as I'm now going to call it, I mean, it kind of supports David's problem in that throughout this entire anti-discrimination law, we have to make these constant judgments about appropriate and inappropriate uses of these protected characteristics. And I'm inclined to think it's a very interesting point. You can't do it. So one was whether that was the same problem. And the other thing was about medicine. So just on the face of it, right, it seems medicine straightforwardly does need to use all sorts of protected characteristics all the time, right? So I mean, my main experience is with maternity care, right? But there are all sorts of questions because ethnicity means, you know, they need to check for things like thalassemia. You know, there's a whole range of things that you know, if you're whatever an Ashkenazi Jew, that they're concerned about, whatever the disease is that they're carrying off more often, yeah, et cetera, right? Huge amounts of questions about characteristics that are deemed to be predictive. Without which I think it'd be really tricky for medicine to function, or at least it would not be able to do quite a bit of good that it does do.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Wasn't a question, was it? Bad.
Well, you know, you can give opinions on opinions.
I just say, I mean, I like Georgie's point that if we want to think about, do we need to avoid protected characteristics of medicine, we need to switch from the cases where something good is going to happen to the patients to where something bad is going to happen to them, and then that might focus our thinking a bit.
Thank you, David. Reuben, I see you put your hand up.
Yeah, just very briefly on the point that Elsie Lynn just made about the use of protected characteristics, and I think there's interesting stuff that happens at the interim when people are trying to work out whether the explanations for ethnic differences in medical outcomes are genetic or social, right? So when COVID hit in the UK, one of the ethnic groups with the highest rates of COVID was Ashkenazi Jews. Now, there's a period where there's a question as to would somebody like me, who's kind of ethnically Ashkenazi Jewish, need to worry about that? If it's genetic, yes. So if I went to my GP and they said, oh, well, you're higher risk because of this, assuming it's some sort of genetic predisposition to be more vulnerable to COVID? Or is it lifestyle? Is it to do with occupancy in homes in the Jewish population in the UK? So there's this interim period where we're trying to figure out what explains ethnic differences in medical outcomes, and in that period, that's the situation that the AI system is in all the time, because it never gets to reason about the difference between a genetic cause or a social lifestyle differences. It treats every type of correlation as the same. It doesn't distinguish between these different things, and so chucking all those variables into a ML model blurs those lines and doesn't give us the opportunity to try and disentangle those things. So I think it's one where you shouldn't rule it out in principle, but you should be very careful about how you use that kind of data. And I think particularly ML is a risk, because it doesn't allow you to do that kind of causal disentanglement or attribution of genetic versus social, environmental, etc.
Thank you, Reuben. If the audience doesn't have any questions, then I'm going to finish on one of my questions. I've got so many questions to ask you, but I'm going to finish one that I think is an appropriate question to finish on, and which is to ask each of the speakers, what are your biggest hopes or fears for the future of AI? That is very broad. You can do with that question what you like. And could I start with you, Reuben, as the last person to speak? Or do you want some time to formulate your thoughts?
Give me a second.
Does anyone want to take a stab?
I can go.
Please do.
So I'm completely bowled over by GPT-3. Any of you who don't know what that is, go and look it up. And I think, this is a hope, that we will quite soon have very smart artificial intelligence systems. GPT-3 can speak English perfectly well. And it seems to me that was the big barrier. Once we got that, we can teach it what we learn in school, and it'll be just like us. That's my hope. The fear is that systems like that will be pretty close to people, and we're going to treat them very badly. And I worry about treatment of AI systems.
Interesting. Thank you, David. Should we go for Georgie? Can I put you on the spot?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it's funny, I couldn't remember whether you said hopes or fears, but I came up with a fear anyway. So, and it has to do with economic disparity. And so there's kind of nicely laid out in things like the very accessible sort of public, sort of popular book, Weapons of Math Destruction, about how the sort of the masses get the treatment through AI, big data, and the sort of the wealthier people get more of an individualized treatment. So then the worry is that the people that have more influence and power are less invested in which AI systems and algorithms are governing the masses. And so she nicely lays out a particular property of those, which is part of sort of her defining feature of a WMD, a weapon of math destruction, which is that it is not it has no error accountability. If it makes errors, there's no built-in mechanisms for noticing that thing. And so if it's doing something like deciding who to interview based on big data, and it's doing it poorly, no one will ever notice that thing. But if it's some like fancy job or fancy college, then the big data algorithm isn't playing that role, something like that. So then the worry is that there's this inequality where the masses, a lot of their major decisions about credit scores and so on. Credit scores is another one where there's big errors and then there's no mechanism for catching the errors. So the masses are governed by these things with no error detection built in. And then the people in power don't really sort of notice or care because they get a more individualized treatment. That would be my worry. And that's a social political worry.
Really interesting. Something I've spoken to other people about before. I think very valid point. Could I lead on to Jonathan? I feel like you might have something to say.
Yeah, I think actually, I have a fear that is sort of continuous with Georgie's, although perhaps in a slightly different direction. Also about the political economy of artificial intelligence. which has to do not exactly with how the level of individualization of treatment that individuals receive, but more with where the productivity gains that are generated by artificial intelligence systems are captured. And I think that there's a big concern that many or most of those productivity gains will be captured by owners of capital, and that rather than workers or consumers. And I think that partly has to do with sort of weak global and national governance systems for the development of AI systems.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. And finally, Reuben, have you had enough time?
Yeah, it took me a while to think about the hope one, unfortunately. But I guess my fear is kind of a return of the kind of statistical fatalism that Jonathan was talking about, but perhaps one that's less. It seems like people like Quetelet genuinely bought their own conclusions. And I feel like we might be sort of sleepwalking into a world where we don't even, really believe that these systems are sort of genuinely predicting what's going to happen, but rather that they become self-fulfilling prophecies. So that's my fear, and my hope is that I do think there's lots of interesting work going on in terms of bringing more of the kind of careful, scientific theorizing that has previously gone into medical research, and combining the best of that with what machine learning systems are good at. And so we get the best of both worlds. So we get kind of causal machine learning models that can do the kind of distinguishing that Georgi was talking about between confounders, and when multiple pieces of evidence can help us rule out, eliminate the error possibilities. So yeah, that'd be my hope.
Fantastic. And thank you for ending this on an optimistic note. That's brilliant. Sadly, that is all that we have time for. I've really enjoyed this session. I've got to work out what to do with all these questions I've got on this notepad now. But I just wanted to say thank you to all of the speakers, and obviously for the audience for joining us, to the Philosophy of Medicine project, and also in particular Winnie, who has just been fantastic in setting all of this up. And I'll pass back over to you, Austin.